Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about hybridization in fiction, because as a biologist, if I'm reading a fictional work and I come across a hybrid or a hybridization event and it's not described correctly, I'm going to notice. And it's something that pulls me out of the books and sometimes makes me rage a little bit. So obviously I want to make a video about it so I can complain. But probably a bit more importantly, I thought this would be an opportunity for me to share some of my knowledge so that other members of my writing community can see what to do or what not to do when describing a hybridization and can not make the same mistakes that I've been seeing in books that I've read. So I have on a previous occasion sat down to make this video, and my plan was to talk about what hybridization requires and limitations on it and those kinds of things, so anybody could take that knowledge and apply it to what they were working on. The problem was that this sent me down a ridiculous spiral of explanations and blah 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 at I think too technical a level, and would have made for a very boring video. And I realised after a couple of attempts to make this video that I can't just present the information and, you know, hope that people will be able to apply it. I think the easiest thing to do is to critique the books that have mistakes in them. Which means that I'm going to have to now criticise the works of some other people. So that being the case, I feel like I need to make it very, very clear that just because I am not completely convinced by an author's description of a hybridization doesn't mean that that author hasn't done their due research. It doesn't mean that they haven't done a good description or anything like that. It just means that I'm an expert. So the bar for me to be convinced is much higher than it would be for any other reader. Just as, I don't know, I'm sure if I was a plumber and I was reading a book about a plumber, I would notice if they used the wrong tool for this or that. We all have our areas of expertise where it's going to be harder for a work of fiction to convince us that it's accurate. It's just that this is my area where the the bar has been set maybe a little bit too high for an author to realistically be expected to reach it in a work of fiction. Is that what I wanted to say? I hope so. My second, I guess, disclaimer / warning is that to do this video, I can only operate in a land of spoilers. So assume spoilers for literally every text I'm going to mention. Anyway, so disclaimers made. Let's criticize some people. So the first hybridization that I want to talk about is in Invincible. For those of you who aren't familiar, Invincible is a comic book which has been turned into an animated series, and it's about Invincible, a teenage boy who has just gained his superpowers as fully expected because he is the hybrid offspring of a human mother and an alien father who is a superhero. He has a range of very impressive superpowers, and in episode 8 we learn that his power is because his people went through a violent eugenics type event. So they had an out-and-out battle to the death which wiped out half their population and left only the strongest of their people remaining, and then they've gone forth and invaded and conquered many, many planets, and Earth is next. During this reveal, we also get this line from Omni-Man.
Viltrumite DNA is so pure, you're nearly full-blooded.
The phrasing here is a massive red flag to me, because within human society the idea of genetic purity is a massive problem. It is something that I could go into kind of an extensive blah blah about, but I'm going to try and have some degree of self-control. and just leave it with referring to DNA as being pure when you're talking about the human population is not acceptable or scientifically accurate in any way. The statement that Invincible is almost or practically pure-blooded is incorrect, just from a basic mathematical perspective. You can't be 50% of something and therefore be almost 100% just because that 50% is high purity. It is still diluted by half. So it's a weird statement in general. However, if we were to assume that every single one of the powerful traits that Omni-Man has, so flight, strength, speed, ability to survive in space, the long lifespan, all those sorts of things, if we assume that all of these traits are dominant and that the eugenics event that his people went through has resulted in a population which is homozygous dominant for all traits, meaning that every single person in that population has exactly the same dominant traits on both chromosomes, then we can assume that Invincible would be heterozygous for each of those traits. He would have received a dominant allele from his father for each superpower, and presumably a recessive allele or sort of non-superpowered version of that gene from his mother. Roughly, we're taking a very, very simplistic approach to our understanding of gene expression and inheritance here, but let's just kind of go with that because we don't have to be geneticists to write stories. So let's assume that Invincible is heterozygous for all superpower traits, and that none of those traits have particularly complex expression. So we're going to assume a classic Mendelian inheritance and expression. In this case, we would expect him to be at a phenotypic level, or at a what you can see level, yes, identical to a full-blooded Viltrumite, which I can never pronounce correctly, so my apologies if I screw it up. So if we assume that he's got those dominant genes, then he would have all those traits and he would appear to be equal in capability and strength with a full-blooded person. But when it came to his children, assuming that he were to breed with a full-blooded human, we would expect his children to then have a bit of a mishmash, some of those abilities, some kids might have none at all, and we could use again, the Mendelian inheritance Punnett squares that you might have done at high school to predict the frequency that we would see in his children, to kind of predict how many kids may or may not have powers. So I realise I've just kind of gone a little bit technical, but basically the summary is what Omni-Man has said is incorrect, but the idea that Invincible could be as powerful as his father despite being a hybrid does hold if we assume very, very basic patterns of inheritance and gene expression. Something that we haven't seen in Invincible is hybrid vigor. This is where the offspring of a hybridization is sort of bigger and more robust or more vigorous than either parent species and able to survive in a new or more challenging environment and can potentially become quite invasive, particularly in the case of hybridized plants. But we're going to ignore that and just stick to the fictional topic. Hybrid vigor is something that we do see in human vampire hybrids such as Blade. In his case, he's a vampire-human hybrid who has all of the vampire strengths, and then his human genes are bolstering the weaknesses, so he doesn't have a problem with garlic or with sunlight. However, whilst he is a good fictional example of hybrid vigor, he's also a really bad example of hybridization, because in this story, vampirism is spread through viral infection through a bite, which is a little bit tricky. So he can't actually be a hybrid, he is merely infected. And there's not really a lot of reason for him to have hybrid type traits. If he was infected in utero, he would just be infected. So he should actually just be a vampire. Keeping with the topic of vampire-human hybrids, let's move on to Twilight, or more specifically Breaking Dawn. In this story, the vampire is this extremely powerful, kind of perfect creature, and the introduction of human DNA has physically weakened them. In addition to having a heartbeat, they are occasionally described as just generally being a little bit slower or weaker than the full-blooded vampire. This is also a perfectly reasonable possibility from a hybridization. Hybrid vigor can happen, but certainly is not the norm. That being said, there are a couple of problems with the human vampire hybridizations in Breaking Dawn. For one, the chromosome counts. In this book, the chromosome counts of humans, the shapeshifters or werewolves, and that of vampires are specifically given. And the thing is, that's where it really falls apart for me, because chromosome counts really matter when it comes to hybridization. The chromosomes that we inherit from our parents need to come in pairs. You have to have one from a mother, one from a father, so you get a nice little matching pair for each of the chromosomes. The problem is that having unmatched chromosomes can cause massive developmental problems. There are only a couple of chromosomes in humans where you can survive having even one additional copy. Usually the egg cell can only go through a few divisions before it perishes if there are additional chromosomes that are unpaired. It's not surprising then that chromosome counts matter when it comes to hybrids. There are some hybrids which will have an unmatched random chromosome, such as a mule. Horses and donkeys don't have the same number of chromosomes, so a mule has one unmatched chromosome. But that's kinda rare. So if we take this information and apply it to Breaking Dawn, where you have 3 different species, and we know they're different species because they have different chromosome counts, and then you try and hybridize them, your chances of getting viable offspring plummets. I could potentially accept the idea of a hybridization between one of the werewolves and a human, because that would leave only one unmatched chromosome floating around in the mix. But a human vampire hybrid is going to have 2 unmatched chromosomes, and that to me sounds pretty lethal. So I would actually not accept a healthy hybrid as a result of such a crossing. I would expect fertilization to fail, probably, or at least very early miscarriage. I certainly wouldn't expect healthy offspring. Moving away from sci-fi and fantasy for a moment, I want to talk about the Earth's Children series. In these books, there are multiple hybridization events between the Neanderthal and the Sapiens. And each hybrid has seemingly random traits, which is not something we see in hybrids. We would expect a hybrid to have pretty standard traits depending on its parents. So even though this book does have a blurb in the front saying it was super well researched and very impressive, yada yada, that is something that I would identify or flag as a potential mistake in the story. On that topic, I think it's also worth pointing out that this book was written in 1980, and even though yes, it was very well researched and is blatantly a textbook in some places, it is still a work of fiction, and it's very out of date. For example, the Neanderthals all have dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, except the most recent book, which was written much more recently, to be fair. But instead of just correcting the mistake, it just has one Neanderthal who has paler hair and eyes, and it's like, oh my god, she's so beautiful. Combined with the fact that the 2 protagonists are the tallest, the whitest, the blondest, the blue-eyedest characters, is a little bit gross. We know that early Homo sapiens in Europe, right through to the UK, were dark-skinned. We know that Neanderthals were in Europe for longer than we have been to date. And whilst there's a little tiny bit of debate about this, it's really possible that some of our paler skin tones and eye colour, hair colour, etc. came from Neanderthals. So describing them as being entirely dark and then the sapiens as being very, very white is wrong, blatantly wrong. But I think that's an indication of the lack of information that was available at the time. I might be being overly generous, but I think we can give the author perhaps that credit that she was operating on a lack of knowledge. Maybe. Of course, that doesn't explain the fetishization of the one black character. The next story I want to talk about is Parkland, which has some pretty impossible hybridizations. There are human gorilla, human orangutan, and also dog-leopard hybrids. However, all of these are acceptable because these are not due to natural matings. These hybrids are created in a laboratory setting, and we never learn anything about the laboratory. We don't learn anything about the technology. We just know that the aliens are doing it. This is a good way of handling hybridizations. You've provided the reader with this reasoning for how it can happen, and it's alien technology. Same thing could actually be done with a magical story. Perhaps you had a, say, human dragon hybrid. If you were to say magical, fine. I don't know anything about magic. Presumably the magic takes care of the, well, mechanical questions and any other biological issues that might otherwise get in the way. So Parkland's actually, to me, an example of a story which takes care of it quite well by explaining less of the story. I'm pretty sure I have now managed to go through all my various rantings about fictional hybridization. Hopefully, we'll see if I actually use this footage in the end, but at any rate, I'm feeling good about it, so hopefully we're done. If, however, I have skipped something that you're curious about, or if you would like further explanation about anything that I've covered, do let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to answer your questions, or if necessary, make another video about this. If you enjoyed this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you're new around here, maybe consider ringing subscribe and ringing that bell so you can stay up to date. Bye!